The Cirque Lumineux was, for one brief, gaslit era, the brightest jewel in America's traveling crown. It was not merely a circus, it was a testament to the impossible, a tent pitched on the crumbling edge of fantasy. On the chilly evening of October 14, 1907, the canvas dome felt like an inverted, velvet sky, humming with the energy of 1,000 people squeezed onto worn benches. Every one of them was there for a single, breathtaking reason: Aurelia. She was the star, the spectacle, the glorious, tragic heart of the show. Her given name was lost to the mists of her European origin, but her stage name hung in the air like a promise. The audience didn't applaud her, they waited for her, holding their breath as if she needed their shared atmosphere to survive. Her act, billed as The Flight of the Phantom, was always the final, most anticipated routine. It was performed without a net, dozens of feet above the sawdust, a deliberate affront to safety and common sense. As the lamps dimmed and the spotlight, a single harsh white beam, slashed through the darkness, a hush fell. It was the kind of silence that suggests a massive, shared intake of air. Aurelia appeared at the apex, already a shadow, hanging impossibly far above the heads of the crowd. She wore a silver-sequined costume that caught the light like scattered moonlight. The music began, a slow, dramatic dirge from the small, sweating brass band, and she launched herself into the void. Her initial swings were flawless, a perfect expression of power and balletic grace. She didn't just move between the ropes, she seemed to hang suspended in the very physics of the space, defying gravity with a subtle, mocking smile. Every sweep brought her closer to the center, toward the grand finale, and the tension in the tent became almost unbearable. It felt less like a show and more like a shared, dangerous prayer. This night, however, there was something subtly off. An extra, almost metallic chill seemed to emanate from the ropes, and a whisper of sound, not wind, but a high-pitched, harmonic whine, seemed to accompany her. The crowd shifted, sensing the difference, their anticipation curdling into foreboding. Aurelia, however, was in her element, soaring toward the climax. The climax of The Flight of the Phantom was nearing. It required Aurelia to swing from a near-vertical drop, gaining maximum momentum, then release both ropes at the precise moment of the arc's highest point. For a fleeting second, she would hang motionless in the air, a breath held by all. It was an instant of absolute stillness before she would catch the descending ropes to complete her return. This was the moment that drew the gasps, the ultimate display of trust in physics and fate. Tonight, Aurelia reached that zenith with a chilling finality. Her body, taut and graceful, extended horizontally as she let go. The spotlight caught her face, a vision of fierce concentration, perhaps even ecstasy. She was suspended there, maybe 200 milliseconds, yet it felt like an eternity stretched thin. The sound of the music faded to a deep, ominous drone from the brass section. The silence was so profound that one could hear the rustle of the sawdust far below. The ropes she had released began their natural backward swing. The audience, ready to release their collective breath for the applause, watched the spot where she should have begun her descent. But the descent never came. One moment, the silver-sequined figure was etched against the black canvas of the ceiling. The next, the space was empty. There was no sound of a fall, no sickening thud, no tear of fabric. She didn't drop, she was simply gone. The ropes, heavy and thick, continued their slow, rhythmic swing, their ends brushing nothing but cold air. It was as if the very light had skipped over her form. The silence that followed was heavy, an unnatural vacuum. For a long, paralyzed minute, the thousands of eyes remained fixed on the empty apex, waiting for the impossibility to reverse itself. Then, a single terrified scream tore through the paralysis, and the roar of the crowd began, a sound of mass hysteria and terror, not of entertainment. The dream of the Cirque Lumineux had just become a nightmare. The sudden, impossible void where Aurelia had been was the breaking point. The single terrified scream was instantly swallowed by a tsunami of sound, a terrifying mix of shouting, weeping, and the scraping of benches as people tried to flee. The brass band, which had held its drone for a beat too long, now descended into a cacophony of panicked, discordant notes before silencing completely. Monsieur Dubois, the ringmaster and proprietor, stood frozen in the center of the ring. His painted smile, designed to convey grand cheer, was tragically split by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. He held his ornate riding crop aloft for a moment, a useless scepter against the unfolding madness, before dropping it with a clatter onto the sawdust. "Silence! Order!" he bellowed, his voice thin and cracking against the roar. But no one listened. Below, the other performers were equally stunned. The strongman, usually a picture of stoic granite, had his massive hands clapped over his head. The clowns, their faces stretched into permanent, manic grins, looked utterly lost and terrified, their painted eyes wide with unnatural fright. They stared up at the empty ropes, their brightly colored costumes making their paralysis look all the more grotesque. In a matter of seconds, the panic escalated into a stampede. People near the exits clawed their way out, tripping over ropes and each other. The remaining performers, snapped out of their shock, began trying to usher the crowd out, their voices hoarse with strain. Meanwhile, a small group of the circus hands, led by the strongman, began the frantic, immediate search. They scrambled up the side ropes, shining small lanterns upwards, checking the rigging and the central pole. They searched every fold of the canvas roof, every shadowed corner of the ceiling. "She must have slipped. She must be up there," the strongman roared, denial battling reality in his voice. But there was no body tangled in the ropes, no piece of torn costume snagged on a hook. There was nothing but the dark, heavy canvas ceiling, the gently swaying ropes, and the overwhelming scent of sawdust, sweat, and now, fear. The impossible was confirmed. Aurelia had not fallen, she had simply ceased to be. The crowd, though thinned, had left behind a palpable residue of panic that clung to the canvas walls. Into this volatile atmosphere stepped Inspector Thomas Finch of the Municipal Police. Finch was a man of meticulous order, accustomed to the logical progression of cause and effect. What he found under the big top of the Cirque Lumineux defied every principle he held dear. The sawdust ring was now roped off. Performers and staff huddled anxiously at the edges, watching the inspector with a mixture of fear and hostility. Finch surveyed the scene with his sharp, analytical eyes. He was looking for evidence of a fall, scuff marks, a pool of blood, a broken bone, but the ground was undisturbed save for the footprints of the fleeing audience. His first priority was the aerial apparatus. 2 officers were sent aloft to meticulously check the ropes and the pulley system. They reported back the impossible. The ropes were intact, securely fastened, and showed no sign of fraying or snapping. The central support beams were sound. There was no secret mechanism, no hidden trapdoor in the ceiling canvas, and no large tear through which a body could have been snatched. "She didn't fall, Inspector," stated a nervous circus hand, adjusting his bowler hat. "If she had, she'd be down here. And she didn't climb out. She was at the top." Finch stood precisely where the ringmaster had been, craning his neck back. He visualized Aurelia's movements, the physics of her great swing. The only way she could have left that spot was down. Yet, the space below was empty. He questioned the ringmaster, Monsieur Dubois, who could only wring his hands and repeat, "Impossible, Inspector. Impossible." Finch's orderly mind wrestled with the irrationality. Every vanishing act known to man relied on speed, misdirection, and mechanics. But this was too high, too exposed, too absolute. He picked up a piece of the discarded rope, a heavy, coarse fiber, and rubbed it between his gloved fingers, realizing with a chill that his investigation was not about finding a body, but about comprehending an absence. This was not a crime scene, it was a riddle wrapped in silk and sawdust. Inspector Finch knew the key to unlocking the impossible was often found in the human element. Ignoring the chaos of the departed audience, he focused on the core troupe, the small, tightly knit family of the Cirque Lumineux. He began his interviews in the cramped, humid dressing tent. The performers, still in costume, were shell-shocked. The strongman, whose stage name was Atlas, was distraught, rubbing the raw skin of his massive hands. "She was the best, Inspector," he muttered, his voice surprisingly soft. "Perfect. She didn't make mistakes." He and the other performers reiterated the facts. No sound, no struggle, just the sudden, clean deletion of a human being. Finch pressed for details about Aurelia herself, her temperament, her habits, her secrets. This is where the accounts began to diverge, colored by layers of awe and resentment. "She kept to herself," said one of the sisters from the juggling act. "A phantom even before the act, you could say. She was dedicated, almost religious about her work. Never joined us for supper, never spoke of family." The clowns, their makeup running with sweat and tears, nodded vigorously. "She'd stare at the ceiling for hours," one whispered, glancing nervously upwards. "Measuring the distance, calculating. But it wasn't just math, sir. It was like she was speaking to the air itself." The consensus painted a portrait of a woman who was obsessed with her art, living solely for the moments she spent airborne. She was not known to have enemies, rivals, or romantic entanglements. However, a young aerialist, pale and shaking, finally volunteered a disturbing thought. She often said that a performance only truly succeeded when it was unrepeatable, when it bordered on the supernatural. She talked about leaving no trace. Maybe she finally got what she wanted. Finch wrote this down, the word supernatural, scrawled beneath the performer's quote. He realized the troupe was not merely in shock, they were in awe of the terrifying efficiency of her disappearance. They knew, intuitively, that this wasn't an accident, it was a dreadful kind of artistic perfection. Inspector Finch knew he needed a witness unburdened by the glamour and emotion of the stage. He found him behind the main tent, nervously coiling heavy ropes by the light of a weak lantern. Jedediah "Jed" Stone, the old, grizzled tent rigger. Jed's hands were rough and calloused, his eyes constantly scanning the complex network of lines above, as if half expecting the trapeze artist to suddenly reappear. Jed was initially reluctant to speak, fearing he'd be blamed for a structural failure. "The ropes were sound, Inspector. I checked them myself before every show." She demanded perfection. Finch spoke to him gently, not as a suspect, but as the only man who truly knew the mechanics of Aurelia's stage. Eventually, the old rigger lowered his gaze and pointed to a dark, remote corner of the tent floor. "It wasn't the ropes that failed, sir. It was something else." He then confessed the chilling detail he hadn't shared with anyone. 3 days ago, I saw her by her wagon. She wasn't preparing her costume or stretching. She was kneeling down in the dirt, tracing something with a stick. Jed described the symbol as a circle bisected by a sharp, upward-pointing arrow, enclosed within a larger, asymmetrical spiral, a design that looked disturbingly old and non-Christian. She looked like she was conducting a secret ceremony. When she saw me, she quickly wiped it away and gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She told me she was mapping the currents of the air. But Jed remembered seeing that symbol years ago, scrawled in an ancient brittle book of local farm lore, a book he'd dismissed as superstition. The symbol, he recalled with a tremor in his voice, was known as the summoning mark for the sky hunter, an old pagan myth about calling upon a capricious aerial spirit to ensure the perfection of a journey, or a performance, at the cost of the traveler's soul. Finch meticulously sketched the symbol in his notebook, the unsettling shape feeling heavier than any physical evidence he had yet collected. Inspector Finch found himself in the local library, a dusty, quiet sanctuary far removed from the stench of sawdust and panic. The simple sketch of the symbol Jedediah had provided felt alien and profoundly unsettling against the orderly rows of books. He consulted Mrs. Albright, the town's elderly, eccentric historian, who possessed a knowledge base that extended far beyond civic records. Mrs. Albright's eyes widened instantly upon seeing the drawing. "That, Inspector, is not a symbol of any modern faith. That is the sky hunter's mark," she whispered, leaning closer as if the walls might hear. She retrieved a crumbling volume, its pages thin as silk and filled with archaic text and woodcuts. She explained that the sky hunter was a figure from old European traveler and Romani folklore, predating Christian influence. It wasn't a god, but an elemental entity, a creature of pure air, wind, and height. Legend says the sky hunter is drawn by absolute dedication and the promise of a perfect ascent. Performers, climbers, anyone who risks their life on the vertical axis, may invoke it. But the price is steep. The hunter guarantees an unrepeatable, flawless climax to the performance, but then it collects its payment immediately. It doesn't allow the performer to return to earth or be diminished by time. It takes them at their zenith, preserving the art forever, Mrs. Albright explained. Finch, a man whose career was built on traceable motives and tangible evidence, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the library's drafty corridors. He scoffed, trying to inject rationality. A myth, Mrs. Albright. An ancient story. Perhaps, she conceded, tapping the drawing. But ask yourself, Inspector. In a case where there is no body, no fall, and no trace, is the explanation of a perfect, paid-for vanishing more impossible than the explanation of a simple accident? Finch had no answer. The legend provided a framework for the impossible absence, terrifyingly coherent in its supernatural logic. Inspector Finch obtained the key to Aurelia's private wagon, her mobile sanctuary, from Monsieur Dubois. The small carriage stood apart from the others, its wooden exterior plain and unassuming. Inside, it was less a dressing room and more a hermit's cell. There were no frivolous decorations, no stacks of fan mail, and strikingly few personal effects. The few pieces of furniture were functional and aesthetic. The atmosphere inside was cold, possessing a strange metallic scent that subtly overpowered the lingering odors of stage makeup and cheap perfume. Finch felt a peculiar stillness here, as if the air itself was resisting movement. He began a methodical search, looking for a journal or a letter that might provide a rational motive for flight, or a personal history to ground the mythical theories. Instead, he found only more questions. The small trunk contained simple, well-worn clothes, an antique book on human anatomy, and a handful of strange items wrapped in linen, dried herbs that smelled faintly of mountain altitude, a piece of polished obsidian with a naturally smooth curve, and a meticulously drawn, hand-copied star chart. The chart wasn't of any constellation Finch recognized. It featured angular lines and symbols that matched the unsettling mark described by Jedediah. On a tiny, fold-down desk, he found her personal ledger. It wasn't a diary, but a detailed, obsessive record of her performances. Not ticket sales or earnings, but measurements. She had recorded the exact height of the big top in every town, the humidity, the speed of the wind currents, and next to each entry, a single word: acceptable, lacking, or occasionally, perfect. The entry for October 14, 1907, simply read, location, local town name. Height, 58 feet. Humidity, low. Wind, still. APEX. There were no other words, no punctuation. The term apex was underlined 3 times, and beneath it, she had drawn a tiny, precise rendition of the sky hunter's mark. It was her final entry, a terrifying and meticulous declaration of intent, confirming that her performance was not merely good, but designated as the ultimate, necessary perfection. Inspector Finch finally cornered Monsieur Dubois in the silence of his gilded, but now shabby, office wagon. The proprietor looked years older than he had on stage. The vibrant red of his ringmaster coat seemed to drain all color from his face, leaving him sallow and haunted. Finch presented the evidence: the physical impossibility of the disappearance, the reports of Aurelia's strange behavior, and the terrifying relevance of the sky hunter's mark. Dubois initially maintained a panicked denial, swatting away the suggestion of folklore with frantic hand gestures. It was an accident. A tragic malfunction. Anything else is madness, Inspector. Finch then shifted his approach, pressing on the one thing Dubois truly feared: the ruin of his business. Your circus was failing before Aurelia arrived, monsieur. Your crowds were thin. Her act was the only thing keeping the Cirque Lumineux alive. You were desperate. At the word desperate, Dubois finally broke. He didn't confess to murder, but to something perhaps worse, a willful, desperate complicity. His voice dropped to a barely audible whisper. I knew she was different. Not just talented. She carried a weight. She spoke sometimes of the cost of height. But she brought the people, Inspector. The tent was full again. I asked no questions. He admitted to knowing about the strange symbols she drew, claiming they were just part of her artistic process. But his eyes betrayed a deeper, more agonizing knowledge. The location we pitched the tent, he stammered, his gaze darting to the floorboards. "The elders warned me. They said this field, this exact spot, was a place of thinner air. A crossing. I needed the prophets, Inspector. I pushed her to perform here. I let her do whatever she needed to make the magic happen." Dubois's admission was not a confession of crime, but a desolate acknowledgment of sacrificing the soul of his star, and perhaps the integrity of the ground itself, for the sake of the spectacle. He refused to elaborate on the crossing or the elders' warnings, only offering a chilling, final plea. "Find the reason, Inspector, not the person. Because the person is already gone." Ignoring Dubois's desperate warning, Inspector Finch delved into the administrative records of the Cirque Lumineux, a history stretching back over 50 years and half a continent. The records were sparse, often handwritten, and marked by a distinct lack of transparency, a natural consequence of a constantly moving operation. What Finch found was not a smoking gun, but a series of unsettling coincidences. Over the decades, the Cirque Lumineux had a disproportionate number of unforeseen accidents involving performers of great height or extreme daring. While no case was as clean or absolute as Aurelia's vanishing, there were several instances: a tightrope walker who simply slipped on a dry wire in 1888, a human cannonball whose trajectory inexplicably veered off course into the dark periphery of the tent in 1871, and an early aerialist who fell and was found days later, his neck broken, miles from the encampment. In each of these cases, local authorities had closed the book with boilerplate findings: accidental death, performer error, or natural causes. But Finch noticed a pattern. These events almost exclusively occurred in the autumn months, in geographically remote locations, often fields that had been fallow for years. More disturbing were the few surviving newspaper clippings that accompanied the records. In an article from 1860, following a fire that mysteriously destroyed an entire wagon of exotic birds, the writer alluded to the circus's strange luck and the local belief that the Cirque Lumineux was blessed by the height, but cursed by the earth. The traveling nature of the circus had effectively scrubbed the historical evidence clean, dispersing the witnesses and the scene before any thorough inquiry could take place. But Finch realized that the canvas tent was not merely a structure, it was a repeated conduit. Every few years, when the conditions were right, the right time of year, the right piece of barren ground, and the right desperate, brilliant performer, the circus seemed to briefly touch a dark vein of ancient energy. Aurelia hadn't been an isolated incident. She was simply the latest, and most perfect, casualty of the circus's long, unacknowledged bargain. Jedediah Stone, the rigger, had retreated to the darkest corner of the yard, nursing a flask and his terrible certainty. When Inspector Finch found him, Jed's eyes were not those of a man seeking answers, but a man accepting a dreadful truth. "She wasn't taken, Inspector," Jed repeated, his voice raspy. "She yielded. That's what the mark does. It guarantees the absolute apex, her word, but the exchange is final. Aurelia was never truly happy on the ground. She lived for the air, for that moment of perfect suspension." Jed theorized that the Sky Hunter wasn't a malicious demon, but a force that upheld a brutal, aesthetic contract. Aurelia had sought to create a moment so pure, so flawless, that it could not be followed, diminished, or repeated. A fall would have been a tragedy, a slow retirement, a decay of her art. Her disappearance, however, was a grotesque, eternal triumph. "She achieved the unrepeatable," Jed insisted, wiping a tear from his cheek. "She was at the top of the swing, completely alone, completely perfect. The contract was fulfilled, and the hunter collected its masterpiece." Finch felt a sickening lurch in his stomach. The rigger's explanation, superstitious though it was, provided a motive for the lack of evidence. If Aurelia had been preserved by an elemental force, she wouldn't leave a body, a drop of blood, or even a scuff mark. The scene remained clean because the event had been absolute. The only physical residue that backed Jed's claim was something the strongman had noted immediately after the chaos: a fleeting, yet distinct scent of lilies that had briefly settled near the empty center point of the ring, only to vanish moments later. A flower not grown on the site, a scent too delicate for the dust and smoke of the big top. To Finch, the lilies were not a clue, but a chilling signature, the fragrant, final payment for the perfect performance. The big top was taken down 2 days later, leaving a desolate, flattened circle of churned earth and scattered sawdust. The Cirque Lumineux was finished, packed away into its wagons, which now sat silent and waiting for an owner who would never come back. Inspector Finch returned to the empty field, drawn by the unsettling magnetism of the unresolved case. The air felt different here, heavier and noticeably colder than the surrounding pasture, even under a bright afternoon sun. It was as if the impossible event had permanently altered the local climate, leaving behind a pocket of supernatural chill. Finch paced the outline of the former ring, kicking at the remnants of white sand that had been spread over the ground. He knew his official report would be an exercise in constrained rationalism, but his gut told him the truth was in the folklore. He scanned the ground one last time, frustrated by the lack of a tangible object. Most of Aurelia's belongings had been catalogued in her wagon, but the performers insisted she always carried a small, silver locket, a seemingly sentimental item at odds with her ascetic nature. It had not been found in her room. Then, his boot nudged something small and metallic near the exact center point of the ring. It was a simple silver locket, tarnished but intact. Finch knelt, picking it up with a handkerchief. It was heavier than he expected. He carefully pried it open, anticipating a portrait or a lock of hair. Instead, one side held a tiny, faded picture of a woman who looked strikingly like Aurelia, but with a mournful expression. The other side was not a picture, but a perfectly formed microscopic etching of the sky hunter's mark. Even more bizarre, pressed beneath the glass, was a single, impossibly fragile feather. Not the feather of a circus plume or a common bird, but a feather so white and fine it seemed made of solidified moonlight. It was the only fragment of the phantom left behind, a final, chilling detail confirming her pact. Inspector Finch stood before Monsieur Dubois once more, the tarnished silver locket, and the chilling lunar feather inside it, resting on the proprietor's shabby desk. This time, Finch bypassed questions about the act and the audience, focusing solely on the unspoken bargain and the cursed field. The feather is not from a pigeon, monsieur. The locket is not a keepsake. It carries her oath, Finch stated, his voice quiet but firm. She traced the sky hunter's mark because she knew this land was a crossing. You admitted to knowing the elders warned you about this site, a place of thinner air. Dubois recoiled, his facade of mere financial desperation finally crumbling. Tears carved paths through his stage makeup. He confessed that when he was a boy working for his father's struggling circus, they were frequently barred from setting up on standard municipal grounds. They were forced to use remote, unwanted plots, places with old, abandoned histories. My father called it the cost of the canvas, Dubois choked out. The land was cheap, but it was hungry. We had strange luck, great fortunes followed by terrible losses. I never saw a demon, Inspector, but I felt the pressure. He admitted that he had seen Aurelia tracing the mark near the main pole weeks ago, and she had told him, "The ground requires a tribute to hold the canvas firm, monsieur. I intend to pay it." He hadn't stopped her. He needed the full tent, the gasps, the impossible fame she brought. He had been a silent accomplice to a ritual, sacrificing his greatest asset to the malevolent spirit of the land, or the air, that fed on ultimate perfection. She wanted to be eternal, not just famous, Dubois whispered, burying his face in his hands. I know this is not a police matter, Finch. This is older than law. Please, forget the circus. Forget the field. If you dig deeper, if you try to follow her path, the canvas may follow you. The proprietor's final, desperate warning confirmed Finch's fears. The truth was not solved by handcuffs, but by sealing away a terrifying, ancient secret. Inspector Thomas Finch returned to his office, the scent of antiseptic leather replacing the disturbing miasma of sawdust and supernatural dread. He sat before his typewriter, the machine usually a tool of clarity, now seeming inert and inadequate. The final report for the case of Aurelia, the vanishing trapeze artist, was due. His logical mind demanded a solution tied to mechanics, human error, or foul play. He had investigated all three, yet the only explanation that fit the absence of evidence was the one drawn from dusty folklore and pagan symbols. He had no body, no witnesses to a crime, and only the chilling, crystalline feather in the locket as physical proof of the impossible. He typed out the official findings, choosing his words with surgical precision. Subject Aurelia. Disappeared mid-performance, October 14, 1907. No evidence of a fall, foul play, or structural failure. Apparatus intact. Conclusion: missing person, likely succumbed to an extreme, unexplained disorientation while at a significant height, leading to an undetected fall, or else voluntarily left the premises by unknown means, taking advantage of the chaotic crowd. He carefully omitted any mention of the sky hunter's mark, the cold spot on the field, the scent of lilies, or Dubois's terrified admission of the crossing. To include such details would not only ruin his career but open the door to a madness he wasn't sure he could contain. The case was officially closed, filed away in a gray folder marked Unsolved, Unusual Circumstances. Yet, the burden of the truth he couldn't report rested heavily on Finch. He knew Aurelia hadn't fallen, she had been collected. He carried the haunting image of the empty swing, and the knowledge that something ancient and demanding still resided beneath the ephemeral, flimsy guise of human spectacle. He felt a deep, personal chill, a constant fear that the next time a circus came to town, he might be drawn, like a moth to a fatal light, to the empty space under the canvas. Years passed. The case of the vanishing trapeze artist faded from the front pages, yet it lingered in the dark corners of regional memory. The Cirque Lumineux never returned. Its wagons and equipment were eventually sold off at auction, the vibrant colors peeling away to reveal the raw, distressed wood beneath. Monsieur Dubois, a broken man, vanished himself shortly after the investigation closed, his fate a footnote to Aurelia's spectacular disappearance. But the legend did not die. It evolved. In the traveling communities, among the riggers and roustabouts of rival shows, the story of Aurelia became a cautionary ghost story. They warned new aerialists about the sky hunter's mark and the terrible price of perfection. They whispered that on cold, still autumn nights, if you stood on certain abandoned plots of land, you could sometimes hear the faint, soaring strains of a dramatic dirge and the barely audible swoosh of ropes cutting through empty air. The greatest fear wasn't that Aurelia had died, but that she was forever performing. Inspector Finch, who went on to have a long, unblemished career, could never quite shake the chill of that night. He kept the gray file folder, thin and innocuous, locked in his personal desk. Every time a strong wind rattled his office window, he glanced up, half expecting to see a silver-sequined figure momentarily etched against the glass, caught at the apex. The truth he buried was simple and terrifying. Aurelia had not sought fame or fortune, but a final, absolute artistic triumph. She paid the highest price, and the universe, or the elemental entity she invoked, kept its end of the bargain. She had transcended the physical, leaving behind a profound absence that was more powerful than any presence. The Cirque Lumineux was gone, but its final, perfect and terrifying act remained, an eternal performance that continued to haunt the memories of those who saw the swing and yet saw nothing at all.